Welcome back, everyone, to another week's Tales of Kleinnak. I am your author, Nate, and this week we're moving on to Chapter 4 of The Adventures of Harry Potter Year 1. A big day for everyone as I just posted Chapter 36 of Year 5 on DeviantArt, AO3, and Archive, an archive of our own, or AO3, and fanfiction.net as well. Man, I don't mind telling you all, there were moments of that chapter that even got to me, and I'm the one writing the darn thing. Like, I literally had to get up and walk away from the screen a couple times to hype myself back up to continue. A few other things are just a little triggering for me as well. So to those of you who are maybe sometimes upset by some of the subject matter, just know that I don't do stuff to, titillate. I do things because, like, there are issues that need to be addressed and things that need to be dealt with, and they are things that affect people. So things happen. So anyway, in other news, I had pretty much probably the most amazing week ever last week. After months and months of job hunting, I'm finally properly gainfully employed. I've been working in customer service since I was 14, and there was a Freudian slip in hotels, which can be hell, since 2013. So about 20 years of my life total in customer service. And for the first time in my life, I'm not. I mean, there's no job anymore where you're escaping people, but hotel work, it's a really different kind of thing. Like, I tell people, like, I can handle having one jerk boss or even two, but when you're working in a hotel, you can have 200 jerk bosses, and it's not even like just one night and they go away. Like, for the last few months, I've worked for a long stay hotel, and those people, like if they don't like you, they're oftentimes there for an entire week, and you have to put up with them for that entire week, and just like nightly reminding you of it and being rude to you. And that's not why we're here. I just want to say how amazing it is to finally be out of that industry, and I'll be making seriously better monies. So on top of not having having to deal with rude, bitchy people who have just learned to be rude and bitchy because they think it means it'll get them free stuff. Like, I'm finally gainfully enough employed that I won't have to be worrying so much about money anymore. That'll be, I don't know what what I'll do with that kind of freedom. I mean, it is going to be a lot of hours. It's an involved job. Like, I'll likely have 60-hour weeks sometimes. I just bring that up because it's going to cause a little shift in the recording schedule here, which means it will have to move to weekends, and kind of letting that sink in, that for probably the first time in my employed life, I'll have weekends. As most of you who work customer service, and I'm going to imagine that's a lot of you, weekends aren't really a thing that happens on customer service. Man, that's it's just, I'm still, it's been over a week and I'm still like trying to take it all in. Anywhoozleby, I suppose we should get on to the chapter then at this point, or why you're all actually here. This chapter, we finally get Harriet starting to really interact with her new school environment and going to classes and learning how Hogwarts really works, as well as how to get along within her new world. Also through the intricacies of making friends and things like that. Now that she no longer has Dudley ruling over her, she's really free to start exploring, like, who she is and everything like that. So, without that further cliche ado, let's begin with The Adventures of Harry Potter, Year 1, Chapter 4, The First Day. It is easy to be deceived when it comes to friendship. I wish I could say there was a definitive way to determine who your true friends are and who your false friends are. That is an often painful lesson that only experience can teach. But do not shy away from a chance at friendship because you are afraid of pain. Embrace friendships wherever you see them, because one true friendship will help you weather 1,000 false ones. But even more than that, it is incredible how often the simple warm smile can turn any friend from false to true. General, retired, Jigme Dorji Wenshuk. Harriet winced as she opened her eyes. The pain wasn't in her eyes, it was in her scar. It was prickling slightly, and as she sat up she felt cold and clammy, and her nightshirt clung to her skin. She vaguely remembered a bad dream, something about Professor Quirrell's turban and a lot of green light, like in so many of the strange dreams she'd had growing up. She also remembered laughter, but by the time she pulled back the bed curtain, all memory of the dream was gone. Harriet climbed out of bed slowly. Out the window, Harriet saw it was still dark outside. She picked up her glasses from the bedside table and put them on. She knew she hadn't slept very much last night, and she would probably regret it by the end of the day, but Harriet crossed to the window and looked out at the grounds anyway. It was still too dark to make out much of anything on the grounds below, and she sighed as she turned around and looked back at the room. The sound of deep breathing was coming from Ronnie's bed. The other three were utterly silent. Harriet walked back over towards her bed, but paused, looking down at her trunk. There was a stack of folded clothes there that had not been there the night before. She knelt down, squinting in the low light, picking up the bundle and carrying it to her bed. She sat and turned on the small oil lamp beside her bed. It was a school uniform. It was her first actual school uniform, not just handed-down clothes dyed gray like the Dursleys had always made her wear before. It was a gray jumper, with a collar and cuffs of banded scarlet and gold, the Gryffindor colors. On the left breast were some words, all intricately embroidered in golden thread. Harriet Lily Potter, first year. She set the jumper aside, and next picked up the white button-up shirt and a scarlet and gold striped tie. Next came a dark gray pleated skirt and a pair of gray knee-high socks that had a red and gold banded cuff at the top. Harriet bit her lip and barely suppressed a giggle of excitement. They were the most beautiful clothes she had ever had in her life. Harriet jumped up and quickly started getting changed. She finished as quietly as she could and stepped in front of the full-length mirror on the back of the dormitory door, twisting this way and that and smiling. It was real. It wasn't a dream. But if it was, it certainly wasn't a bad one. She heard a moan behind her and turned, seeing Ronnie pulling back the curtains. She was wholly disheveled and looked around grumpily through half-opened eyes. Ronnie's moan seemed to have roused the other three, and one by one the curtains on Hermione, Lavender, and Parvati's beds were pulled back. Harriet walked back and sat on her bed and turned the small mirror that had also appeared there during the night towards herself, trying to mess with her hair that was still sort of all over the place. Harriet turned at an exclamation from Ronnie behind her. She watched as Ronnie hurried over, beaming, and held out her own jumper to Harriet. She leaned over and read the inscription. Ronnie Muriel Weasley, first year. "They got my name right!" Ronnie exclaimed in delight. Harriet smiled up at her friend. "Oh, good," she replied warmly. "Why was your name listed as Ronald anyway?" Lavender asked out of the blue. Ronnie glared at Lavender, who didn't seem to realize she'd asked an offensive question. Parvati nudged her hard in the ribs with her elbow, and Lavender muttered, "What?" under her breath in an oblivious way. "If you must know, before I was born, my parents were so sure I'd be another boy, they picked the name Ronald. Then I was born in the middle of the night, and after that, my dad was so tired, and my mum was obviously asleep, so when he filled out the birth certificate, he accidentally put down the old boy name, not the new name my mother had picked out, Rhonda. After that, of course, my family happens to be rather poor and wasn't able to afford the price to change my name legally, so my whole life's been, well, let's just call her Ronnie then and hope no one notices, okay?" Parvati and Lavender blinked, and even Hermione gave Ronnie a glance that might have been vaguely sympathetic. Harriet felt her heart sink for her friend. It explained so much she'd been wondering about in both Ronnie's personality and her name. "Sorry," Lavender said softly. The whole room went quiet and slowly started getting dressed. Harriet felt herself blush a little, as the other girls seemed to show no shame as they just all started changing into their uniforms. Harriet had never shared a room with other girls before, or in fact anyone, and she did her best not to look as they did. "So, how did everyone sleep?" asked Parvati quietly to the room at large, apparently trying to diffuse the sticky moment. Hermione and Ronnie both gave noncommittal grunts, while Harriet merely shrugged, still mostly averting her eyes as nonchalantly as she could. As she stole a few glances, Harriet couldn't help but notice Hermione was dressing at top speed, and in scarcely more than a minute she pulled on her robes over her uniform and departed from the dormitory with her bag. Ronnie dressed more slowly, and while Parvati and Lavender had already dressed, they were now being held up by dallying with their hair. Harriet, meanwhile, stood by the end of her bed, feeling a little awkward as she waited for Ronnie to finish dressing. "Oh, Harriet, here!" Lavender said, walking over briskly, and before Harriet could respond, Lavender brushed up her fringe up over her right ear and pinned it there with a small silver hair clip. Lavender smiled and led Harriet over to her mirror, showing Harriet the effect. Harriet saw her cheeks go a little pink. The hair clip was shaped like a running cat, the sight of which gave Harriet a warm feeling she couldn't describe, like it triggered a deeply buried happy memory long forgotten. "Oh, wow! Thanks so much, Lavender," Harriet said, blushing brighter. Lavender beamed, and Parvati walked over with earrings looking eager. "Here, Harriet, how about these?" Parvati asked, but Harriet blushed even brighter. I don't have any piercings, sorry," Harriet muttered under her breath, and Parvati lowered the earrings, looking crestfallen. "Oh, well, that's okay. Maybe we can fix that later," Parvati said as she hitched a smile back on her face. This didn't cheer Harriet up as much as Parvati seemed to think it should, but Parvati didn't seem to notice. Feeling anxious, Harriet quickly thanked Lavender and Parvati before turning back, looking to see how far along Ronnie was, but was only quick enough to see Ronnie disappearing from the room. Harriet felt herself deflate a little, but Parvati and Lavender smiled and sat her back down in front of Lavender's vanity before she started combing Harriet's hair. Parvati got out some blush and began lightly applying it to Harriet's cheeks, along with some light eyeshadow. "Your skin's so nice, you don't need much of this, I don't think," Parvati told her before she applied it to Lavender as well. After that, they each looped an arm into one of Harriet's, and they all went down to breakfast together. It was slow-moving getting there, since they were still entirely new to all the moving and trick staircases and locked and false doors. It took somewhere around 20 minutes to finally get to the Great Hall. Despite her relief at finally reaching their destination, however, her mood changed dramatically once they finally entered. As they walked in, Harriet could almost feel as well as hear the whispering that broke out everywhere. She blushed and hung her head a little, suddenly wishing she hadn't worn Lavender's hair clip and could hang her hair in her face and try to be invisible. She shivered, feeling like every eye in the world was on her as Lavender and Parvati hugged her arms tighter in theirs and walked towards the Gryffindor table. As they approached, Harriet immediately looked for Ronnie. She quickly spotted her sitting at one end of the table with Dean, Seamus, Kieran, and Marcus. She also noticed Hermione sitting alone at the far opposite end of the table, and Neville sitting sort of nearby, as if he had tried to sit with her but got too scared and just sat where his courage finally gave out. Harriet decided to stop to sit by Ronnie and the boys, but Parvati and Lavender steered her further down the table to where Fred and George were seated. "Good morning, ladies," Fred said, smiling as he spooned a generous helping of scrambled eggs onto his plate. George had an overlarge stack of pancakes as he was cutting into bites barely small enough to fit into his mouth and dousing them in syrup. Harriet felt a little put off by the gluttonous display, but Lavender and Parvati beamed at them unperturbed. "So I'm Lavender," said Lavender, tossing her curly brown hair and batting her eyes. "And I'm Parvati," Parvati said, doing her best to look charming. Harriet merely felt foolish as Parvati and Lavender looked at her, expecting her to introduce herself too. We've met," Harriet said with a sheepish look at Fred and George, who merely chuckled as they started wolfing down their food. "Charmed," Fred said, through a mouthful of eggs, giving a little salute, and George nodded. "We're Fred and George," he said through an equally large mouthful of pancakes. At this, Parvati did look a little skeptical and shot Lavender a look. Lavender, however, didn't flinch. "Oh, so you two have met Harriet, then?" Lavender said. "Oh yeah, helped her onto the train yesterday," said Fred before taking a deep gulp of his milk, barely managing to keep it from splashing a little down the front of his robes. As they did, Harriet suddenly felt herself getting a little suspicious. She thought she had gotten a pretty good idea of Fred and George's personality yesterday, and somehow this slovenly display was starting to seem like just that, display. Finally, George gave a belch, and now even Lavender seemed like her interest was waning. Harriet casually helped herself to some eggs too, as Lavender and Parvati shot glances at each other from behind her. "Well, I think I'm going to talk to those girls over there, Lavender said, starting to rise. Coming, Parvati, Harriet? Parvati nodded, but Harriet looked at Fred and George, both of whom gave her the slightest of winks, so she merely shrugged. No, you two go. I just started eating, Harriet said. Parvati got to her feet and joined Lavender, both looking a little disappointed. Harriet looked back at Fred and George, both of whom had suddenly started eating as regularly as anyone else. George was even cutting his pancakes into smaller bits. You two are a piece of work, you know that? Harriet declared, shaking her head in amusement. Fred and George only laughed and beamed. We know their type, George said with a shrug. Yeah. Oh, he acknowledged I exist. Time to move in for the kill, Fred went on while putting some ketchup on his eggs now. So you're leading them on? Harriet asked, again feeling her opinion of them dropping. Fred and George both looked aghast. Not at all. We were completely, genuinely excited they ended up in Gryffindor, so we cheered them loudly. No leading them on at all, said George, looking wounded. But we were excited for everyone that ended up in Gryffindor, not just them. Hey, we're third years after all. It's not our first rodeo, so to speak. Fred elaborated with a shrug. So when types like those two show up, we just put on the slob act. Nips it right quick, we find, George said with a chuckle. Harriet just shook her head in amazement and finally took a bite of her eggs. In her hunger, Harriet barely suppressed a groan as the egg slid into her stomach. Now Fred fitted her with a slightly disapproving look. Now you, on the other hand, we're a little disappointed in. Harriet sat up straight, caught off guard by this statement. Me? Why? George put his hand on Fred's shoulder, and Fred nodded, conceding. Well, George said, you were just more under the impression you were becoming Ronnie's friend, he said in a slightly big brotherly way that was taking Harriet aback. Harriet looked down at her remaining eggs. I am. I mean, I want to be. I don't know, she said haltingly, trying to find the right words before she just hung her head a little, looking at her plate. Harriet, Fred started, leaning over. Have you ever had a friend before? He finished delicately. Harriet looked up at him and shook her head. Well, that would explain it. Yeah, said Fred. Neither's Ronnie. Fred and George looked at each other and then back at Harriet. Gotta be careful with friends when something sets you apart, makes you, cool. Which is something we know all about, of course, chimed Fred in a cheery tone. Right you are, brother of mine. You have to be on the lookout for clingers, kind of like we rather suspect Parvati and Lavender are. Harriet blinked a little, giving a glance down the table at Parvati and Lavender, who were looking put out. But they seem so nice. Lavender gave me this hair clip, and they did my makeup and hair for me. I've never worn makeup before, Harriet said, pointing to the hair clip in her eyeshadow. Fred and George nodded. I'm sure, but they don't want to be your friend to be your friend. They want to be your friend because of who you are, George said sagely. How do you know? Fred snorted. It was written all over their faces when they came in with you. They were grinning like they just won a beauty pageant. You couldn't see them because you were too busy pretending you didn't exist. Harriet blushed more before glancing up the table at Ronnie. But when Ronnie came into my compartment, she just wanted to talk to me about being Harriet Pot. Fred chuckled, cutting her off. We told her to go into your compartment. We thought you two'd be a good match as friends. Harriet blinked. Her image she'd been building up of Fred and George was melting away drastically. She stole another glance down the table at Ronnie and felt a bit of shame. But she's mad at me. Fred and George looked down the table too and shook their heads. Nah, Ronnie never gets that upset. Yeah, Fred said with a nod. Just go down and sit by her now. But don't let her get up and go without you once you get there. She doesn't get that upset, but she can get melodramatic. And don't let Lavender and Parvati intercept you, George cut in as an afterthought. Harriet blushed, looking back at Lavender and Parvati. So what should I do about Parvati and Lavender, then? Fred and George merely shrugged. Be nice to them, said Fred. Let them see there's more to you than being famous, George said with a wink. Harriet nodded and bit her lip. She was about to stand up when she got a sudden idea. She sat back down and looked at Fred and George seriously. Okay, she said stiffly. I'll do it if you promise never to tease Ronnie about her name again. Fred and George now looked taken aback and defensive, But Harriet put a very determined look on her face, and the twins finally smiled and nodded. "You drive a hard bargain, Potter. It's a deal," Fred said and held out a hand. Harriet shook it, and then she finally stood up and started walking down towards the other end of the table. Lavender and Parvati looked up at her hopefully, but then pouted a little sulkily as Harriet remembered George's warning and sped up past them. She reached where Ronnie, Dean, Seamus, Kieran, and Marcus were all sitting. The 4 boys smiled at her as she approached, but Ronnie, who was done eating by the looks of it, started to get up. "Oh, Ronnie, wait, want to, find first class together in a bit after breakfast?" Harriet asked quickly. Ronnie paused halfway up and finally looked at Harriet. "You sure?" Ronnie asked. "You sure you don't want to go with them?" She nodded at Lavender and Parvati, who were looking over at Harriet, looking even more disappointed. Harriet shook her head. "No, I want to go with you. You're my friend," she said, trying to sound firm. Ronnie's ears went pink, but she sat back down and nodded. "Okay, then." Harriet sighed in relief and quickly sat with them. She had just enough time to smile at the 4 boys around them and open her mouth to ask them how their first nights had gone, when there came the sound of many rustling pieces of paper high above them. Harriet looked up and gasped to see an entire horde of owls come streaming into the great hall through an opening in the ceiling. Owls of every sort imaginable were fluttering around, landing on tables and giving letters and packages to students. A sizable tawny owl landed right in front of Marcus, who beamed and pulled off her letter. "Hey, Esper, thanks," he said and stroked the owl's head gently. The owl hooted softly and nibbled Marcus's finger back. "Everyone, this is Hesper, my owl. Hesper, this is everyone," he said. The owl hooted, looking at them all in turn. Without warning, Hesper spun, snatching 2 pieces of bacon from Dean's plate before spreading her wings and launching herself into the air, utterly silent except for a slightly victorious hoot. "Hey!" Dean called after the bird, but to no avail, and grumbled, helping himself to more bacon. "There was a whole tray there. Why did he have to take mine?" Dean exclaimed in exasperation as everyone else laughed, except Marcus, who muttered, "She." Despite that, Marcus smiled and finally opened his letter. "It's from Dad," he said, opening and reading it, his smile increasing with each line. Harriet looked around at the other students. Draco Malfoy had a large box of sweets from his parents, evidently, and was grinning smugly at the different jealous faces around him. Kieran's friend Scott had a letter, too. As she kept looking, she spotted Hermione again down the other end of the table, and felt a slight frown come onto her face. She should have thought to go and invite her down to join them, too. Harriet jumped as something white swept past her vision. It was her snowy owl, Hedwig, who was now sitting on the table in front of her and hooting warmly. Harriet smiled at the owl, who wasn't carrying a letter, but it seemed had merely flown in just to see her. Harriet reached up and gently stroked Hedwig's fluffy head. "Hi, Hedwig. Getting along well with the other owls?" Hedwig gave a little hoot, which Harriet took to mean yes, and smiled at the other students who were looking at Hedwig admiringly. "This is Hedwig. Hedwig, this is Ronnie, Dean, Seamus, Kieran, and Marcus," she said, gesturing to each of her new friends as she said their names. Hedwig gave another little, somewhat dignified hoot, before she too silently flapped off towards the opening in the ceiling. Guess now my bacon's not good enough," Dean muttered ironically as he watched her go. "She must have caught a mouse already," Harriet said, watching her go. Now Professor McGonagall came around, handing out the new timetables to all of the students. Looking at it, Harriet saw her very first lesson would be History of Magic with Professor Binns. Ronnie groaned. "Oh no, I've heard about Professor Binns." Harriet looked up nervously, worried by Ronnie's tone. "What about him?" she asked, the 4 boys looking on with just as much curiosity. "Yeah, I'd rather like history," Kieran muttered indignantly. "It's not the subject, it's the teacher. Binns. He's a ghost, and he's ridiculously boring," Ronnie said, rolling her eyes. "He apparently just drones on and on," Ronnie said dismally. The rest continued to look disbelieving that a class taught by a ghost could be boring, but Ronnie didn't seem to notice. Finally, breakfast ended with a ringing bell and an enormous clattering as everyone got to their feet. Harriet hitched her bag up onto her back and smiled, waiting for Ronnie. Ronnie got up too and smiled back, holding out her arm. Harriet beamed and looped her arm into Ronnie's, which was a little awkward given Ronnie was a half a head taller than her, and with the 4 boys, they went off to find their first class. Getting to their first lesson took nearly as long as it took getting to the Great Hall. Even with 6 of them, they kept running into dead ends. Marcus at one point tripped into a tapestry that gave way, revealing a secret passage behind it. They all looked at it curiously, Kieran even a bit eagerly, though they decided that now, just before their first class, was probably not the best time to go exploring. They finally started up a staircase and thankfully reached the classroom. Seamus reached for the handle, but jumped back with a nasally yell. A small, brightly colored arm had shot out through the door and grabbed his nose. "Gotcha, conk!" Cackled a loud voice, and from out of the door shot the rest of Peeves, the poltergeist. Seamus yelped and spun around, trying to throw Peeves off. Kieran even tried hitting Peeves with the club of his shillelagh, but it sailed straight through the poltergeist, who cackled more. "Poor ickle firsties, best be on your toes. Keep your whittle witsies, or Peeves'll get your nose." Peeves cackled insanely and finally let go of Seamus's nose and rocketed down the hall. Seamus groaned, rubbing his nose and shaking his fist after the little poltergeist. "Let her get," he mumbled as he rubbed his aching nose. The rest of them did their best to look sympathetic and not laugh, as they were all inclined to do. They filed into the classroom, and as they did, Harriet saw the only other first year who had found the room already, Hermione. She was putting some of her school things back in her bag and wiping her eyes. Peeves had evidently decided it would be just as good an idea to grab her bag and dump her things all over the room as it was to catch Seamus's nose through the door. Harriet crossed over to her and knelt, picking up some of Hermione's books. "Oh, thanks," Hermione said awkwardly as she took them. "Mind if we join you?" Harriet asked. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Ronnie shake her head quickly, but even though she was anxious to please Ronnie after this morning, she ignored her. Hermione looked around at the rest of them before she slowly shook her head. "No, that's fine. Go ahead," she said, retaking her seat. Harriet smiled, and they all moved in, taking seats around Hermione. Harriet noticed that Hermione kept her head low as they sat. At first, she thought Hermione was trying to hide that she was blushing behind her thick hair, but at a second glance, she realized Hermione was smiling ever so slightly. The door opened behind them, and Parvati and Lavender finally came in, both of them giving Harriet dirty looks. Harriet felt her cheeks grow hot as she looked away, and wondered a little if Fred and George had been right in their assessment of the 2 girls after all, as they seemed pretty genuinely offended. Regardless, as she had to live with them, Harriet wanted to be sure they stayed on good terms. She tried to wave them over, but they took 2 seats in the back of the room and ignored her. After Neville finally made his way into the room, they all turned to face the blackboard. Kieran opened his mouth as if he was about to ask something. When everyone jumped, Neville fell out of his chair. A ghost had come straight out of the blackboard. He looked very old, and he cleared his throat as he started addressing the class. Harry couldn't help but feel that throat clearing was probably not that necessary for a ghost. "Today we are going to discuss the Goblin Rebellion of 1876, which resulted in the deaths of—" Harry didn't know what it was, but something in the way Professor Binns spoke seemed to be sapping her brain of energy. His voice was quivery and droning, and very measured. Harriet found she couldn't focus, and instead found her attention drifting to Hermione's quill, which was flying across her parchment taking notes. In front of her, Kieran seemed to be doing an all-right job of fighting off the apparent effect of Professor Binns' voice, but after a good 20 minutes, even his head was starting to droop a little, a full 5 minutes after Ronnie had started snoring. Harriet nudged her a little with her elbow, making her snort. Despite all these things that would be apparent distractions in another teacher's class, Professor Binns seemed utterly oblivious to them. He just kept staring at his notes and talking. Beside her, Marcus was grumbling irritably. "This is history. This is supposed to be exciting things that happened that made everything the way it is," he muttered, shaking his head at Professor Binns incredulously. "He's making it sound like he's giving directions on how to cook noodles." Harriet barely had time to nod in agreement when the bell rang. With a massive wave of relief, she got to her feet, putting away her unused ink, quill, and parchment. Kieran and Marcus had managed to make some headway, while Dean and Seamus had played numerous games of hangman. Ronnie's parchment was stuck to her cheek as she sat up with a start. "Well, that was a fascinating lesson," Hermione exclaimed excitedly as Professor Binns floated back out of the room through the blackboard. The rest of them merely looked at her and shook their heads, disbelieving. "Well, it was! I mean, the way Blagnock thought of that counterattack by tunneling under the wizarding forces and attacking them from right under the wizard's feet!" Harriet blinked a little. She vaguely remembered hearing the name Blagnock, or was it Gladrock? Harriet merely shrugged and turned to the rest as they started making their way out of the room. "Well, what's next?" Seamus asked, pulling out his schedule. Harriet pulled hers out too. Next was Transfiguration. She was somewhat excited for this class, as Professor McGonagall was the head of their house after all. Harriet was interested to see what she was like in lessons, though she was sure she wouldn't be much different than her stiff demeanor the first few times Harriet had seen her. She was right. They had just sat down in class when Professor McGonagall strode in with her books. Her hair was still done up in its tight bun, and she stood before the room, turning and surveying them. "Put that away, Miss Batu. When I am in the classroom, my class is officially in session, and magazines are not permitted in here. This is your first warning." She barked, and from the back of the room Parvati squeaked, and there was a rustling of papers as Parvati put away the magazine she and Lavender had been reading. Professor McGonagall's eyes scanned the room. "Miss Brown, straighten your tie. Mr. Finnegan, tuck in your shirt. Miss Weasley, pull those socks up, please. I do hope you all were not looking like this while representing Gryffindor House in other classes this morning," she said in a huff. Harriet looked around, seeing Seamus, Lavender, and Ronnie all look sheepish as they adjusted their uniforms. "Welcome to Transfiguration," Professor McGonagall said as she started the class. "One of the most difficult subjects taught at Hogwarts, and without proper, thorough study and practice, you will not go very far in this class. Break any rules in this classroom, and you will leave and not return," Professor McGonagall said as she glared down at them all. Harriet felt herself shrinking with every word, and she saw Ronnie sliding farther down in her chair as Professor McGonagall spoke. However, most of this was forgotten the moment Professor McGonagall turned and tapped her desk with her wand, and at once the desk turned into a pig. It gave a high-pitched squeal at the collective gasping that swept over the classroom, but before it could bolt, Professor McGonagall promptly turned it back into a desk. "Now," said Professor McGonagall, turning back to the class, "it will take rather longer for you all to accomplish that. Not until after many, many years of study and practice. Today you will be starting by turning matchsticks into needles. But," she said over the outbreak of excited murmuring, "first, you must take notes on the proper procedure for doing so. Open your books to Chapter 1. Professor McGonagall hadn't been exaggerating. Transfiguration was hard. Harriet hadn't had another real magical class to compare it to yet, but compared to History of Magic, where apparently the hardest part was keeping awake, it was rocket science. It required not just deep concentration, proper recitation of the incantation, and precise wand movements, but it also needed an understanding of not only the nature of the object you were transfiguring, but also of what you were turning it into. You had to be able to visualize both precisely at the same time. After the whole hour of class, a half-hour studying and note-taking and a half-hour trying to do it, only Hermione had accomplished any change in her matchstick. It had gone all pointy at one end and become silver-colored, though it was still made of wood. Apparently, she was the first student to have ever gotten that far in the first day of any of McGonagall's classes, and she gave Hermione a soft smile of approval. This, of course, annoyed Ronnie, who muttered darkly as Hermione walked loftily just a few paces ahead of them, talking to Marcus about how she'd accomplished it. Harriet, whose arm was still hooked in Ronnie's, gave her arm a consoling squeeze, and Ronnie seemed to loosen up a little. They were making their way to the greenhouses now for herbology. Herbology, as it turned out, was rather enjoyable. It was much easier than Transfiguration, and much more interesting than Professor Binns's History of Magic lesson. Professor Sprout was a very good-natured witch, contrasting to Professor McGonagall quite a bit. Harriet found she rather enjoyed the feeling of working, doing something with her hands. She'd always been required to help Aunt Petunia in the garden back home, pulling weeds and digging holes. But herbology was utterly different. Instead of just back-breaking labor, it was learning the proper soil and lighting conditions for plants, how best to handle them, as well as what properties they had for use in things like potion ingredients and healing, how to tell what was poisonous and what was not. Harriet, Ronnie, and Hermione were at a table together, Dean, Seamus, and Marcus at another, Kieran and Neville at another, and Parvati and Lavender at yet another. She, Hermione, and Ronnie were doing better at their table than Parvati and Lavender were, both of whom seemed extremely reluctant to get their hands dirty, especially just before lunch. Harriet couldn't help but smile as they worked. By the end of the class, all of them had hands entirely covered in dirt, and they all had dirt smudges all over their faces. Even Ronnie looked like she was warming up to Hermione by the time they made it to the castle and headed for the first girls' toilet they knew. As they entered, they were greeted by a horrible sight. The toilets were all overflowing, and the girl who looked only a couple of years older than them was floating around the ceiling and wailing loudly. It was just at the second glance that Harriet noted the girl was a ghost. The girl ghost paid them no mind as they slowly backed out of the toilet, doing their best not to step in the rising levels of water, when they turned around to an even more horrible sight. A wheezy, balding man was glaring down at them angrily, while a bandy-legged cat with bulging yellow eyes mewed up at them from the man's feet. Its eyes almost made it seem like it was smirking at them. "What are you three doing?" the man snarled. Going quickly through her memory banks, Harriet finally remembered who the man was, Argus Filch, the caretaker. "Nothing, sir," Hermione squeaked, looking terrified. "We just stopped into the bathroom and the toilets are overflowing and there's this girl flying around and crying." Filch didn't look convinced. "A likely story. Covered in filth, tracking dirt on my nice clean floors, and I bet you're the ones who upset Myrtle to boot, aren't you? And I have enough to do around here without pesky first-years like you causing trouble like this." "We didn't upset Myrtle," Ronnie declared in a huff, putting her hands on her hips. "And we didn't even know that was her name until you just said so." From the bathroom, there came a renewed screaming wail. "Oh yes, no one knows poor Myrtle's name!" "It's our first day!" Ronnie yelled back. "Didn't bother to ask, did you?" the ghost named Myrtle yelled back. "Ronnie, you're making it worse," Hermione declared in exasperation. Ronnie had just started to round on her when yet another voice piped up from behind them all. "Excuse me, but what's going on here?" came a stuttering voice. It was only now Harriet was aware of the smell of garlic, and they turned to see Professor Quirrell. He was looking back and forth between Filch and the students. "Professor Quirrell, these students have been trucking dirt into the castle, and they've upset Moaning Myrtle and made her clog and overflow all the toilets." "Nonsense, Argus. We all know Myrtle gets upset by the slightest thing. To blame it on these students is silly." "Silly?" exclaimed Filch, outraged. "There's nothing silly about blatant vandalism of—" Harriet turned to Hermione and Ronnie, both of whom looked back with the same expression. Without another moment's hesitation, all three of them bolted, running up the corridor towards the stairs. Filch yelled after them, but it seemed he wasn't chasing. They stopped at the top of the next staircase, and all looked at each other, before Harriet and Ronnie both fell over laughing. Hermione was still looking a little worried they were going to be in trouble, but before long she too smiled and looked a little relieved. "Saved by Quirrell, eh?" asked Ronnie as she pushed herself back up from the wall. "Who'd have thought?" "Yeah, it seems so," Hermione said, tossing her bushy hair. "Well," Harriet said, looking around, "suppose we'd better find a bathroom on this floor, then." The three of them walked down the hall until they finally did find a bathroom, which was thankfully free of wailing ghosts, overflowing toilets, and best of all, Filch. After washing up, they went down to lunch. While there, Hermione, though much to Harriet's trepidation at first, repaired Harriet's broken glasses with a spell she had learned from reading ahead in their charms textbook. She could even see more clearly through them. After lunch, they had a free afternoon, though the looming homework the Professor McGonagall had given them already blunted the free aspect. Hermione, of course, had none, as she'd managed to change her matchstick even marginally in class already. Harriet wasn't finding homework all that easy as they sat studying in the Gryffindor common room, not so much because of the subject matter, more because of how other Gryffindor students seemed to whisper about her when they saw her. Finally, she snorted in annoyance, and Ronnie did too. "Let's go up to the dorm," Ronnie suggested. Harriet and Ronnie hitched their bags up on their shoulders and started up for the staircase to the girls' dormitories. They climbed to their first-year dorm, but stopped after stepping inside. Parvati and Lavender were there, reading the magazine that Professor McGonagall had reprimanded Parvati about in class. Both girls turned less than favorable looks on Harriet and Ronnie as they entered. "Oh, hello," Lavender said shortly. "Hi," Harriet and Ronnie said in unison. There was an uncomfortable pause as Ronnie and Harriet looked at each other sheepishly and made their way to their beds. "So how was your first day?" Harriet asked Lavender Parvati, though she kicked herself for asking it shortly after. Lavender and Parvati didn't respond, merely shrugged indifferently. After a few minutes, Hermione came in too, looking disgruntled. "It's so noisy down there," she exclaimed, looking over her shoulder towards the common room. They all looked up at her, Harriet and Ronnie having only just now taken out their books, while Lavender and Parvati were still sitting by themselves and murmuring. Hermione looked around at everyone and gave out a groan of exasperation. "So much drama on just the first day!" she exclaimed again in aggravation. All four of the other girls leaned back in surprise as Hermione turned and stomped out of the dormitory, muttering something about the library. The four of them looked around the room awkwardly, all of them looking somewhat ashamed of themselves. Harriet and Lavender went to say something at the same time, but both stopped before Harriet finally plowed ahead. Hey, would you two like to work on McGonagall's homework with us? Parvati and Lavender looked at each other, then back at Harriet and Ronnie. Okay, if you want to try some of these hair charms with us later, said Parvati. Harriet smiled, but looked back at Ronnie, who seemed a little less thrilled at this idea. Oh, come on, Ronnie, Harriet said with a smile. Ronnie looked from Lavender and Parvati to Harriet and finally nodded. Fine. She groaned, but still smiled. Despite the awkwardness of the earlier part of the day, it ended up being one of the most fun nights Harriet had ever had. Even Ronnie was smiling by the end, though all in all, very little homework got done. They mostly talked and laughed about their home lives. Parvati and her sister, Padma, were the daughters of immigrants. Their father was a Muggle businessman, and their mother was a witch who worked for the ministry, monitoring trade in potions ingredients. Lavender, on the other hand, was a pureblood like Ronnie. Harriet ended up in a sticky situation after this news when she asked if Ronnie and Lavender's families knew each other. Ronnie, Lavender, and Parvati all gave Harriet a dumbfounded look before cracking up laughing. What? Harriet asked bashfully. Lavender responded first, sitting up. Just because we're from two pureblood families doesn't mean we automatically know each other, she giggled, sitting back up, and pulling Ronnie back up too. She finished running the tip of her wand along Ronnie's fringe, repeating the incantation in the magazine over and over again, so they swept across her forehead instead of falling in her face. Harriet's hair, meanwhile, they had a harder time handling. Harriet was reluctant to do any hairstyle that exposed her forehead, wanting to keep her hair covering her right forehead at least, so it covered her scar. In the end, Parvati and Lavender settled on curling the ends of Harriet's hair and giving it a small wave. Harriet had also tried to give back the hair clip Lavender had given her earlier that morning. However, Lavender refused, telling Harriet she could keep it, saying it looked better in her straighter hair, and also noting how it matched her glasses, which had also become somewhat shinier since Hermione repaired them. They asked Harriet about her life now, which Harriet was more reluctant to talk about, but as they had all talked about theirs, she felt slightly obligated. Parvati and Lavender looked just as shocked and outraged as Ronnie had at the stories of her bullying by her cousin. As she looked at them all, she felt better and better about her life finally. Things were looking up. After another few hours, Hermione returned. Her look when she saw them all laughing was not entirely dissimilar from her expression when she'd seen them all not talking. "Hermione, want to join us?" Parvati asked excitedly. Hermione looked at her in shock. "Join you?" "Yeah," said Lavender, smiling and nodding. "We could help get your hair to be not so, huge." Harriet groaned, and Parvati elbowed Lavender in the ribs again. Hermione, meanwhile, had turned a bright shade of scarlet, and turned from the room without another word. The four girls looked at each other. "Should we go after her?" Parvati asked delicately. Harriet simply shrugged. "I don't know," she admitted. In the end, they decided to give her time to cool down and went to dinner instead. Harriet had hoped Hermione would be there so she could talk to her and try to get her to join them again. However, Hermione wasn't there. Harriet hoped in her head that Hermione had already eaten. "Think we should try and find her?" Harriet asked nervously, looking towards the door. Ronnie shrugged. "She doesn't want to eat, it's her choice," she said indifferently. They quickly found Kira and Marcus, and this time Neville, and sat with them. Parvati and Lavender wasted little time introducing themselves to the new boys, who didn't seem the slightest bothered in introducing themselves back, as Fred and George had been. They talked all about how their first day had gone, as they helped themselves to a hoard of steak and kidney pies, pork chops, vegetables of all kinds, and several puddings. Dinner was delicious as ever. And before long, Harriet did give a look down the table at Fred and George, who each gave her a discreet wink and a thumbs up in unison. She excused herself and got up from the table and walked down to where Fred and George were sitting. "So, think you may have been wrong about Lavender and Parvati," she said in a slightly victorious tone. Fred and George merely shrugged. "I wouldn't get too full of yourself there, little one," Fred said with a smile before taking a bite of steak and kidney pie. "Yeah, I think you simply did what we told you to do," said George. "What was that?" asked Harriet, trying to remember. "Showed them there was more to you than being famous," Fred grinned. "Now scram, you're going to ruin our reputation with all this making us be nice to the new kid business." Harriet beamed at them before returning to where her new friends were all sitting. Ronnie gave Harriet a questioning look, while Lavender and Parvati still seemed to have some barely suppressed jealousy, but she let it go. After dinner, they returned to the dormitory. There they spent the rest of the evening talking about boys. Lavender and Parvati both seemed to be utterly boy-crazy. Ronnie was still pretty much in an all boys are stupid, mean, ugly jerks frame of mind, while Harriet herself personally felt pretty indifferent to them, having never really talked to any growing up because of Dudley. Finally, they all started to get tired and started getting ready for bed. Harriet again felt a strong urge to avert her eyes as the others changed. She climbed into bed and wished the others good night before drawing her bed curtains. Hermione came in again a short time later. No one said anything. Harriet felt anxious. After they had gotten so close to her earlier in the day, still she was getting distant. Outside of her bed curtains, Harriet could hear Hermione getting ready for bed. She rolled over and curled up a little as she heard Hermione give a deep sniff before she pulled her bed curtains closed. It was an unfortunate blemish on what was otherwise a happy end to an excellent first day. Oh well, at least things can't get much worse after all, she thought to herself as she reached up and turned down the oil lamp above her head. They'd had classes, they would get better at finding their way, and things could only go up from here. But as is so often the case in life, and almost always the case at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, she should have known better.